Now, this session has set the scene for session 2, which is on the subject of 5G network deployments and initial learnings from industry, regulators and government, what's in place, what is missing in the ecosystem. And to moderate this session, I would like to introduce Jean-Jacques Sahal. So over to you, Jean-Jacques.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be on this conference and speaking with you today. We've got a fantastic panel, so I'm not going to make a lengthy introduction. I think we're all aware of both the promise of 5G, but also the challenges of 5G. We've got a panel with an audience representing a number of the stakeholders involved, from telecom operators to equipment manufacturers to the regulatory community, both to give us a bit of a situation update, but also to look ahead and think about the appropriate regulatory practices and also some of the wider considerations that we should think about in relation to the development and rollout of 5G, especially with a focus on our region. And if I may, I would love to start by introducing our colleague speaker from the International Telecommunications Union, who, although he will give us, I think, a bit of an update from the regulatory community, also has experience in industry itself. So Dr. Riaz, if I may ask you to share with us your thoughts and findings as well from some of the studies that the ITU has done. I think would be a wonderful way to kickstart the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahil. So good day, everyone. My name is Amir. I'm part of the regional office team for the ITU Asia and the Pacific. And I'm based out of Jakarta, but I cover the special network infrastructure for all the region. For this presentation I would take like 7 minutes, and the 3 major things that I will discuss is some of the key insights of one of our study that Sahil mentioned already. What we did is that we took note of the IMT spectrum. IMT is the term journal we use for the mobile systems, and IMT 2020 is the latest one, which is the equivalent to 5G in ITU. We did a survey of Asia and the Pacific and saw what and how the spectrum has been given in the last 5 years. So it's just some observations and some key insights. The study would be published later on. Some key considerations apart from that study, and some opportunities on how we could work together towards the future development. So just a recap of what we have for IMT for the all mobile spectrum. Right now, the identified spectrum after the WRC19 is above 19 gigahertz. Majority of this is in the higher bands, what we call the microwave bands, but there is also a considerable amount of spectrum that is available in the lower bands as well. And we have seen that most of the spectrum, even below this in 6 gigahertz, even that is not available in some of the markets for the mobile operators. So for the study, what we did is that we prepared a kind of a database of what has been done in the last 5 years. Out of the 37 countries that we saw, there were spectrum access that was given in 34 of the countries. Most of the countries took the auction method, but there are others that chose other beauty contest bidding, like for example in China and Philippines as well. And the spectrum that was the most commonly given was the 700 megahertz spectrum. Now this one was awarded for both 4G and 5G services, but the other one that is only for 5G was given was the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum. Millimeter wave spectrum was also allowed and given to the operators, but this was mostly in the developed countries, and the developing economies, they are yet to see this millimeter wave deployments and rollouts of 5G in that sense. Now, the most common length of the license that was provided was 15 years. There have been some, this is the average that we saw, but this also includes some of the existing expiring licenses that were renewed for 15 years. But in some of the cases where 5G was given, some regulators took a very cautious approach and gave a kind of a license for 3 or 4 years just to test the market and then develop a strategy for a longer term. So we have both ends, in which there was a very short duration license, and even in some countries 20 years license were also awarded, but on average the length was 15 years. The other thing that we saw, that apart from the 2G and 3G network switch off, there were some conditions that were introduced by some countries to have to become first in the curve of introducing 5G. For example, in case of Philippines, they didn't charge the spectrum, but they put the conditions to have coverage and good throughput across the countries. So these were part of the license conditions. In case of China, for example, for the first 3 years of the 5G license, there was no spectrum fee that had to be paid. And after 3 years, there was a progressive 25%, 50 to 75%. So in this way, the idea was to encourage the rollout of 5G. In case of Thailand, when 2.6 gigahertz spectrum was also awarded, the conditions were that for the East Economic Corridor, they had to provide coverage up to 50% in the first year. So in this way, they used this assignment of spectrum in a very strategic way to develop not only the smart cities, but also the economic zones as well. So, and to have the competitiveness in the market, spectrum caps were also introduced. So just some key learnings from this that we thought that might be useful is that from the regulatory point of view, and for generally for the operators as well, it's very necessary to have some kind of like a spectrum outlook chart available, so that the operators have some idea of what's coming, and they could have a business plan accordingly. To facilitate the industry, there has to be some kind of interventions, positive interventions in a sense that if you are going to do refarming of spectrum, that spectrum is used by some incumbent services, then a good approach would be to have a spectrum refarming fund established, so that the incumbent, they could be, assured that they would not lose any money when they refarm from the existing spectrum. In addition, because the 5G is more capex intensive, both in case of infrastructure and the requirements for spectrum, per megahertz per pop price has to go down. If we use the similar approach that we are using for the previous generations, that might not work, because then we would have less money remaining with the operators for the infrastructure. And lastly, there has been good progress in not tying the spectrum licenses with the technology, and we have seen most of the countries going away, but there also has to be an increasing understanding of how to use the spectrum in a TDD mode, because in TDD mode there is going to be some specific issues related to cross-border interferences. So the countries, specifically in the Southeast Asia, which have a lot of population on the borders, they need to work together a strategy on synchronization and frame structure to make sure if the 5G is deployed on TDD basis, then the issues of this cross-border interference could be minimized. Now, there's some other good ways that could be introduced by the regulators. As we know that the 5G, especially in the urban areas, it has a lot of requirements of the backhaul, and the metro fiber in most of the areas in the developing countries is not ready. So some kind of thinking towards a wireless backhaul should also be given, in a sense that very high bands should be made available for wireless backhaul, and also some easier approach to using the bandwidth that could be made available from the LEO or MEO satellite constellations that are coming up. One other way that we could facilitate this backhauling is if we could standardize the way leave agreements. Usually these way leave agreements are done by the local governments, and each local government has a different standard. If there is an intervention from the regulator to kind of like have a standardized leave agreement, then it eases the process of deployment for the operator. On the policy side, active and passive sharing of infrastructure, the policies and regulatory guidelines should be made available. And one good way ahead is to have an asset database. In a sense, what street furniture would be available for deployment. And this asset, if it's made available, the information is made available to the operators, it would help lower down not only the cost of the operators, but also it can have a positive effect on the speed of deployment, especially in cases when we saw in the earlier panel as well, that one of the focus of the governments in the past 2 years has been on recovery from the COVID. To be on the fair side, I think it would be also useful for the regulator to see what could be the business case, to have developed a business case and understanding by themselves, doing an independent economic assessment, and then arrange the spectrum prices and other license conditions accordingly. So I think these are some of the best suggestions that we could say, but all of this could not be done in a single-handedly. There has to be a collaborative approach. All the regulatory from the regional organizations, service providers have to work together, and in some areas they are more relevant than the others in the deployment of 5G, as the chart mentions, which we took from the World Economic Forum report. You can see that there are some organizations that are more relevant in some components than the other, but all have to work together to make sure that the development comes in a much more harmonized way. From ITU side, we have initiated a Partner to Connect Digital Coalition. I welcome all of you to join this. We are not looking for funds. We are looking for expertise. We are looking for whatever you can provide in terms of development. So I welcome you all, if no matter which organization, what kind of organization you are from, get connected, and so that we could develop further. I think this is my last slide. Thank you, Sahil. Over to you.
And thank you very much, Mr. Elias. I think that was a perfect introduction to the state of play and some of the approaches, but also some of the challenges, I think. And we'll come back to that. I will, once the next speaker speaks, I might just send a link to the Partner to Connect initiative as well, which is worth having a look at. And with that, to take us into the considerations directly from one of the regulators, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Wei Chung Tang from Taiwan. He is an alumni of both the University of Taiwan and Tokyo University, I believe, and a professor now at the National University of Taiwan, as well as the commissioner at the regulator NCC, and very well versed in those topics, which I believe he's a topic of focus for many years now. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Tang. Please go ahead and share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you.
Hello, Jinjack, and all the panelists and everyone who attending this conference. I'm Wei Chung, and first I want to express my appreciation for the invitation of IIC, such that I can take this opportunity to share some recent progress of Taiwan in 5G development. The first thing I would like to give some background knowledge is that the NCC, the Taiwan's regulator, launched the first auction in the end of the year 2019. And 7 months ago, in July 2020, the main telco company started the 5G service. And till the number of the last December, the current coverage of the 5G services has reached 87.5% of population. So I think that the deployment of 5G service, I can consider it very smoothly. And then for the and from this year, but in fact, from the past 12 months, the most effort that NCC is putting on with is 5G private networks. There are some issues related to the 5G private network. The first thing is that the Taiwan government has announced to the public that 4.8 to 4.9 gigahertz frequency band will be released during no later than the end of the year 2022. So first, NCC has to be ready once the frequency band is released and announced by the Executive Yuan, the highest administrative agency. And however, there are many companies developing the component for the base station and the MIMO units. And also there are companies like QCT, the Guangda Cloud Technology, developing total solution for standalone 5G networks. So when making up the regulation rules, NCC has to consider how to push the deployment of a 5G private network, and in the meantime, how to help this industry sector to extend their business. Therefore, NCC has launched many forums with the industry sector and communicate to learn how what's their expectation and what is their concerns regarding to the regulation. And for the example, the biggest concern from the industry is that in Taiwan every year the frequency band license owner has to pay for the annual fee, and they were given that the first 5G bandwidth auction has at that time it is said that the average price per megahertz per person is the highest in the world. So this industry sector worries that the annual fee is also too expensive to afford. And the second is that the existing regulation law called the Telecommunication Act forbid the so-called the private network to connect to public network. And unfortunately, the 5G network, private network, is also categorized into the traditional private network. So they worry that how NCC will limit their usage to connect to private network, or to maybe forbid the end device connecting to private network to first connect to the internet. On the other hand, there are 5 telecommunication companies in the Taiwan market. 3 bigger ones taking around 85% of market share, and the remaining 2 taking 15% of the market share. They for this telco company has the same concern, but with opposite opinions. For the annual frequency fee, this company asked the NCC to give the same rate, because they have already paid so much money on the frequency from 3.3 to 3.57 gigahertz in the first auction. The secondly, they want the license to the private network to be released with a high threshold, because that the current telecommunication companies worry that this 5G private network owner might use some way to bypass the regulation law and to serve to the public just like the normal public service. Given this background, what NCC has done in the last year includes the first is that we allowed potential 5G private network owner to apply for temporary frequency band to test, to set up their experimental 5G network free of charge. And of course, they have to apply for some temporary license and have to renew for every 6 months. But however, it is very easy to renew their license. And secondly, we also have prepared the draft for regulatory rules relating to the 5G private network. The annual fee of the 5G band is determined by a very complicated formula. The way we design this, the formula is to fulfill the expectation of both sides. The list price itself is based on the auction, so it is kind of expensive. However, we also set up some filters such that the applicants, when they fulfill some condition, they can benefit and enjoy discount, multiple discounts. And the last thing is that in fact, it is not just the SA 5G network. For the 5 telco companies, we also encourage these telco companies to extend their business on the private networks. So we also let this company to waive some of their annual frequency fee. And most 15 of the cost may be used to remit their annual frequency fee if they build some private network which is really utilizing the the benefit of the 5G network, not just another private network, but this private network should be based on intelligent system and doing the AI and enjoy the low latency. If the private network fulfills this requirement, then their annual frequency fee can be waived for at most 15%. So I would like to introduce the Taiwan experiments. So this is the first part, and I would like to, I'm willing to answer any relating question. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tang. I'm sure there will be questions indeed. I think you already illustrated very well some of the points that were apparent in the study that Mr. Riaz was talking about from the ITU, some of the issues with telecom operators' concerns over return on investment effectively and the cost of investing in 5G and how a regulator might want to engage in a discussion around that, but also how to balance those considerations with the wider interest in 5G from other parts of the economy, especially because 5G really is arguably more than just a new network technology, but really a way to rethink various economic sectors, or all economic sectors potentially, and how we can use networks and data to support the economy as a whole, which is so important post-COVID in this period of economic recovery. So I think there are two really interesting angles, at least, which I hope we'll be able to pick up in the Q&A section. And to tell us more about the reality and some of the regulatory approaches in another part of the region, I'm delighted to welcome Harin Greval. Harin, welcome again. You are in charge at the Singaporean regulator IMDA of a cluster of divisions that look after this whole area around spectrum, networks, telecom. You also happen to be in charge of SG-NIC, which takes care of the .SG and associated numbering. And I see that you're also active in your spare time, I suppose, in the ITU Study Group 20, dealing with IoT and smart cities in particular, which would have been, I think, having taken part in ITU discussions before, I don't know what it would be like to be in virtual meetings for the past couple of years. Must have been an interesting experience there. But with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to you, Harry, to please share with us your observations, but also your longer-term thinking about 5G, how to encourage its development, and some of the novel regulatory approaches, perhaps, that you're contemplating. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. I presume you can hear me. Thank you to IIC as well for inviting IMDA to share a 5G experience. And Jean-Jacques, yes, you mentioned number of portfolios. There is no spare time. There is no spare time. So ITU is actually one of the, as Study Group 20 joined because of smart cities and IoT, but it takes a lot of time as well. Happy to share at some other platform. But for today, let me see whether I can share my screen here, if this is visible. So today what I'll do is very briefly go through Singapore's experience in calling the 5G call for proposals and awarding the spectrum, and just to give a quick update of where we are now with respect to 5G in the next 5 to 7 minutes. So given where we are in the equatorial belt in Asia here, one of the prime spectrum bands for 5G, which is 3.5 gigahertz, was actually somewhat constrained. We do have satellite use, both in Singapore as well as our neighboring countries, Malaysia and Indonesia. So in terms of available spectrum that we could award for 3.5 gigahertz, we had roughly more than 200 megahertz of spectrum only. And so we had some considerations as well to say that, we don't want to, we have 4 mobile operators, and we don't want to parcel this out into small chunks to the point that none of the operators can do anything that's, significantally better than 4G, because you do need a sizable bandwidth of spectrum to actually give better effect to 5G, especially in regards to throughput. So the decision, even though we had 4 operators, was to issue 2 parcels of 3.5 gig spectrum. So the 2 parcels were 100 meg each. So firstly, 2 networks would provide some element of competition. And also, I think because 4 operators bidding for 2 parcels, there will also be some element of competition. But at the same time, we decided not to go with an auction approach. So I think other speakers have also spoken about this to say that, in 5G, one of the considerations is the investment is better spent in the infrastructure rather than in paying for the frequencies, paying for the spectrum. And so we sort of took that approach as well to say we set a reserve price, and then we let the operators come in and bid for the spectrum. It's one of the parameters. I mean, in the call for proposals, there were several parameters where there was a weightage given to them. So price of spectrum was one of them. But as you can see from the left-hand side of the slide, there's also coverage and user experience. And because it was not an auction, it was a call for proposals, it was also an opportunity for IMDA in this case to put in certain conditions to say that if you get awarded this parcel of spectrum, conditions are your network must be secure and resilient. you must offer standalone 5G capabilities. And so when we measure your coverage, we only measure your standalone coverage. Even if you deploy NSA, non-standalone, it is actually not part of our 50% or 90%, 95% coverage obligation. So in the CFP, we had all these requirements. At the same time, in the CFP, we also awarded millimeter wave spectrum. So millimeter wave spectrum, we had a fair amount, quite sufficient in the 26 as well as the 28 gigahertz band. So all 4 MNOs bid for it and were awarded 800 megahertz of spectrum each. So in combination, the 3.5 gives the wide area coverage and the obligation to provide nationwide coverage. The millimeter wave, there is no quality of service obligation, but they must put the spectrum to use. There is no QoS, and those are actually really meant for localize. Since then, actually quite recently, just last December, we have also refarmed the spectrum that was previously allocated to 3G. So the 2.1 gigahertz spectrum has been refarmed. All the 4 mobile operators have obtained some amount of spectrum. We have reserved some for 3G as well. So 3G is not sunset yet. So 3G has been, in a way, grandfathered. So some of the spectrum will be available for 3G. But in awarding this 2.1 gigahertz spectrum, one of the players who did not originally get spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band has now managed to obtain 2.1 gigahertz, and they will also be able to provide a nationwide network. So taking the 2 bands together, the 3.5 and the 2.1 gig, there should be 3 nationwide networks in place by Jan 2027. The coverage obligations are actually 50% by the end of this year, 95% by 2025 for the first 2 networks. And actually from what we're seeing on the ground, some of the operators have already achieved 50% at the end of last year, even though the obligation was end of 2022. And as I mentioned, this measurement that we take is only for 5G standalone. So besides being a regulator, IMDA, you'll see in our name, we are both development as well as authority. So besides being an authority, we also have a developmental role. So in awarding 5G, we also wanted to make sure that the rest of the ecosystem was in place and ready. So we have, over the last 2-3 years, put in place programs, both for capability development, for the industry, to train workers, to train operators and vendors in 5G, as well as to have use cases. So one of the issues early identified by the operators was that the use cases were not so clear. So as we awarded the awarded the spectrum to the operators, we also worked with industry and worked with government agencies and the ports and the airports to allow use cases to be carried out over various locations. So we set aside a pool of money in 2019. You can see from the slide about 30 million for research, industry use cases and test beds. More recently, as some of these use cases became more mature, we have set aside another pool of money to help commercialize some of these applications and for them to be incorporated into enterprises. At the same time, we have a few sites where the open test beds by industry can come in and try out 5G use cases and platforms. So this is my last slide. I want to keep this portion brief. I'll take the rest in Q&A. We always get questions. So now that you have awarded 5G, what's next? And there's always an eye on 6G. 6G is still very vague. I know there are a couple of speakers later from the industry who probably can address this better. But at the moment, there's a lot of interest in the 6s. There's a 6G, there's Wi-Fi 6E, there's the 6 gigahertz band, and there's a lot of interest in all the 6s. But it's still early days yet. But what we have done is, together with our National Research Foundation, again, we've set aside a pool of money to facilitate R&D in this. We also have a partnership with the university in Finland, Oulu University, again, to see whether they can conduct workshops, research, and others together with our industry and so on in 6G. So that is funded through the Future Communications Research and Development Program, or as we call it, the FCP. So in the short time for the intro, I will leave it here. I'll be happy to take questions later on. Thanks, John. Back to you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have questions on 6G as well, for those that want to attempt to define what it might look like and when it will be rolled out. I think that's a sort of interesting question since we're still talking about rollout of 5G. I'm glad to hear some of the news that you mentioned to us. So I'll be able to use my 5G phone soon properly. And I look forward to that. With that, I know he's going to pick up on a few of the points that have been raised and tell us his industry view. I'd like to call on Dr. Bharat to join us from the Ooredoo Group. We've already heard about some of the questions about the rollout and hybrid use, things like that. And really look forward to his perspective on some of the current regulatory challenges, but also, again, thinking about tomorrow, what's really important for all of us. So with that, Dr. Bharat, I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques, and thank you to the IIC for organizing and inviting me to speak. Let me share some slides with you. I haven't got many, but just to set the scene. Okay, so hopefully you can see some slides now. I think we've already mentioned this before in terms of 5G and how connectivity plays a key role, not only in this session, but the one before. But I think it's worth really highlighting the importance of connectivity as part of the wider digital ecosystem. So within 5G, obviously, you have the connectivity side of things. And here you have a lot of policy regulatory issues that come to play. But then you have other things that sit on top of that: IoT, artificial intelligence platforms, which seem to be a big thing, drones, potentially, blockchain, smart contracts, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, augmented and virtual reality, digital twins. These are all things that everybody talks about when we talk about a digital economy, but all of them are premised on having the connectivity layer in place. And when we're talking about things like AR and autonomous vehicles and drones, you're really talking about connectivity that is not only fast, but has low latency. So that's where really 5G comes to play. So 5G connectivity is really fundamental to drive the wider digital economy that most countries are aspiring to do these days. And that's great as an aspiration. I think, we can see that 5G is critical. And I think a lot of policymakers are pushing for 5G and pushing for quick rollout. But I think from an operator's perspective, an industry perspective, we need to step back in terms of understanding where we are today in terms of a kind of industry perspective. So from an industry and MNO mobile industry perspective, there's growth, but limited opportunities in terms of financial growth. So there's massive data growth, exponential data growth. There's intense pricing and price wars in most countries. EBITDA tends to be worrying for most operators. Investment requirements, even for 4G, was massive, but 5G will be extraordinary, especially when you have large countries. Singapore is different because it's a city-state, so investment still, yes, massive. But if you talk about Indonesia, the investment required to cover Indonesia is going to be incredible. We've already captured most of the customers, but there's a few customers that will be difficult to capture, so capturing tail. And then really, what is the USP? And I'll come on to this in a while. For MNOs, what are we delivering that will allow us to charge a premium for delivering 5G to our customers? So if we talk about 5G specifically, the business case is flaky at best. We haven't seen many use cases today that we can monetize really. Slicing offers hope, but it carries with it some regulatory issues, and probably more so in Europe than it does in the region, but still there are some regulatory issues. There are talks about Open RAN, and that may help reduce some of the costs, but it's too early, and we're not quite sure whether those things will be able to scale and deliver the quality that we as MNOs would need. And when you're talking about the different services that 5G enables, so enhanced mobile broadband, from our perspective, is more of the same. And so when we offer this to customers, we are finding that in Ooredoo, in some of our markets where we deployed 5G, it's very difficult to charge extra customers for delivering something that's just slightly faster than 4G, for instance. Then you have the ultra low latency services, but they really come into play when you have augmented reality, virtual reality. So yes, we can see the use cases, but they're not there yet in a mass market perspective. And then you got the kind of the services that deliver massive connectivity of sensors for IoT. The problem there is these tend to be low value chirping devices, and again, some of them can be delivered over 4G. You don't really need 5G for that. So when you're looking at what 5G delivers, today it's very difficult for operators to monetize that infrastructure. Yes, moving forward, we see opportunities to do that, but today is quite difficult. Then you look at the kind of infrastructure rollout and the kind of policies around infrastructure. We need more sharing. I think the infrastructure costs for deploying 5G are going to be massive. So operators should be given opportunities to voluntarily share their networks, and not only passive but active sharing. We need to think about geographic divide. So obviously in urban areas, we see a business case for deploying infrastructure, but in the rural areas, it's quite difficult to do that. So policymakers need to think about whether we need nationwide ubiquitous coverage from day one, or whether we should incentivize at least rollout in urban areas and then a pathway towards the other areas. USO, and again, if you look at connectivity, 5G as being part of the kind of key underlying infrastructure for wider digital connectivity, I think we need to raise the question of, is the USO as it stands today fit for purpose? Who should contribute, given that the entities that benefit from 5G rollout aren't necessarily the MNOs, but other digital providers. So I think there's a big question mark around who should contribute towards the USO. It will require massive cell deployment, and that in itself is a cumbersome process in most countries. So how can we streamline the permit process to deploy cells? Fiber backhaul will be required for 5G. Deploying 5G and still having microwave connectivity isn't going to deliver the kind of benefits that we all aspire to for 5G. So fiber backhaul, and how can regulatory policies, regulatory interventions help in addressing what is a problem in most countries. And uniform pricing, is this still the goal? So in the voice era, there was in today's data era, 4G services, there's a regulatory kind of requirement of a uniform pricing. Is that still relevant when you have 5G networks and you have these different slices that we talk about? And then obviously the perennial question that you would expect a mobile operator to raise is spectrum. So some spectrum licenses have unrealistic coverage obligations. Given what I just said, which is the infrastructure costs, the business case being flaky, putting unrealistic coverage obligations in 5G early on is going to slow down the deployment of 5G, and operators will have to think carefully of what they invest in. Pricing for spectrum is an ongoing issue, but again, in 5G, given that the costs of deployment are going to be significant, do we want to put artificial high prices for spectrum? So I think looking at spectrum pricing again will be critical, and what methodologies we use to kind of price that. And I'm suggesting using a cost avoidance methodology is probably preferable to a plain auction. Dynamic spectrum sharing is seen as a useful interim step for most operators to deliver 5G early on. And then we're talking about the actual spectrum bands themselves. So obviously we talked about this already. I think the 700 band is critical for coverage. The 3500 band is again critical for delivering 5G, and it has its challenges, as was raised earlier in the case of Singapore, that some of the satellite operators do occupy some of that band. So there is a need to work out how we can utilize that band. We do need long-term certainty. So really we want spectrum licenses that are 25, 30 years in length. Having a 15-year spectrum license may have been okay in a 3G era, but in 5G, when you are investing the amount of money we're talking about, you really need a longer period of time to recover that investment. So we need a lot more certainty in terms of the spectrum durations. And in terms of spectrum utility, we need more IMT spectrum, and we need to work out where that spectrum is best utilized. Is it the MNOs? Is it the satellite operators? Is it the broadcast operators? So I think policymakers need to rethink that old debate we have on a regular basis. So that's the kind of reality that operators face today. And from a kind of policymaker side, I think what we're saying is then you need to look at this from two sides. So what I've talked about so far was probably on the supply side. So yes, we need more spectrum, we need backhaul solutions, licensing terms, streamlined deployment, et cetera, but there's a demand side, I think, which we really look the policymakers to look at. So how do we generate the use cases and demand for 5G services? So I think stimulation of government demand, whether that's e-government, e-health, e-education, et cetera, is something that we really call upon policymakers to look at. And then all the kind of applications that will sit on top of the 5G connectivity, I think we need policy and regulation to enable those things as well. So autonomous vehicles, unless you have regulations and policies around that specific application won't take off. Virtual reality, augmented reality, there's not many issues, but there are some issues in terms of copyright and privacy and so on that come to play when you're talking about those things. Smart city infrastructure, again, we need policies around that, maybe things like open data to ensure that happens. IoT itself, interoperability, standardization, etc. So, and also cybersecurity, obviously from a user perspective, that's something that plays a key role in terms of if customers are going to use some of the applications that are coming on. So I think the ask from the industry side is, yes, we need to address the supply side, and I've looked at that, but actually let's not forget the demand side, because without the use cases, it's very difficult to monetize the investment in 5G. And I think Harin Garwal also just did actually mention that, and IMD did spend a lot of time and money, I guess, in developing those use cases. And I think we need to learn from Singapore, but apply it in other countries. Obviously, Asia is a diverse region, so it's very difficult to take what Singapore does and apply it somewhere else. But as a principle, we need to look at both the supply and demand sides. So the kind of final call, I guess, is we need a bit more of a joined up approach. And to do that, it's not really the telecommunications policymaker doing this. They really need to be talking to a wider government base, because you really need to talk to the finance minister in terms of how do you tax these things. You need to talk about the wider government in terms of how you develop education policies, autonomous vehicle policies, etc. And also the education plans as we move forward, as we talked about earlier, in terms of the skills that are required by the population to use some of these services. So actually what we need is a whole of government approach. It's not really just a telecommunications ministry's problem. It is a whole of government problem that we need to think about in terms of how do we put in the enabling policies, regulations to get 5G investment in there in the first place, but then how do we make sure that it actually is used by the consumers and the businesses within the country, and it starts delivering some proper economic value to the country itself. I'll leave it there. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, and happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was very wealthy in lots of interesting directions. I actually just wish we had more time. Hopefully we can continue the discussion. I'd love our colleagues to pick up on this from the panel and also from the audience when we get to it in a minute. And even though you already raised a lot of important issues for now, for the next few months, but also for the next, say, 5 years. And I think that Guillaume for Nokia has got even more, unfortunately for us, that he wants to add. But also I'm hoping also some suggestions, some recommendations. So just a quick background that Guillaume used to work for Alcatel-Lucent in Europe in similar positions. I remember working with his team back in Brussels, Florian and others. We had a lot of fun. We still have a lot of fun. We talked about 5G at the time, exactly the same way we talk about 6G today. Now we're realizing the real challenges that we have with 5G and those bigger, wider considerations that Dr. Barra just talked about. And Guillaume, I think you've got some interesting perspectives as well from your perspective as another part of the telecom value chain. Thank you.
So thank you, Jean-Jacques, for reminding me that I'm getting old and that Brussels was a very long time ago, more than 10 years now. So it's very, very nice of you to introduce me like that. So I've got some few slides as every panelist before me. First, of course, I would like to really thank IIC for inviting Nokia to participate to this event. It's always a a good platform to exchange about best practices and also to further assess what are the main roadblocks, what we should think in terms of policy and regulation to move beyond and really facilitate the investment. So thank you again to IIC. And I was listening to the first panel that was an introduction panel, but it was already quite an interesting one. And I think that right now we have a lot of point already on the table. So I hope that I will try not to repeat, and I hope that I will give another angle as well. So yeah, we have talking about spectrum, we have talked about use cases. So I want to just make, I would say, what is the reality right now? So 5G is, let's be honest, this is already a reality. We could talk about use cases and maybe that the price, etc. But we see that there is an appetite from the operators to move ahead. And we saw that even the first launch is well ahead to what we have experienced before with LTE. So as you can see, we've got more than 200 operators have launched 5G across 72 countries. There are investment in 5G standalone. We've already launched 5G standalone like 20. So they are really even pushing the boundaries. And I think Irene mentioned that it was one of the strategies as well for Singapore to move even a step further quickly. So you can see that even on device, so the whole ecosystem have taken shape and are really trying to be there for the launch of 5G. So we have already more than 400 million 5G subscription. And yeah, by the end of 2021, we can even say that 20% of the global population is already covered by a 5G network. So I will put aside, so you have, I would say on the side, the frequency that are typically used. And I think that really highlight what has been said before, the criticalities between the low band, the mid band and high band, where I would say the mid band is, I would say, the major spectrum bands that is currently used for spectrum allocation. But of course, you see that there are some band like 700 or 800 that is critical. We see, of course, the deployment in some countries concerning mmWave, so above 6 gigahertz. It's something that is taking shape. It's taking a bit more time, but I think that the ecosystem is already willing to move forward on that. So as you can see, I will just show you an example concerning the usage of 5G. So the main point is here in South Korea, which was one of the first countries to launch 5G in the world. So you see how fast the 5G subscription has taken up, and you can see with all the graphic that yes, it's now already 28%, let's say 29% of the total mobile base right now, and we have seen the 5G data per month that is multiplied by 2 or 3, and I must admit that I should have even showed the slide for 4G at that time when I was working for Alcatel-Lucent, and it was already impressive. So you see that every new generation of technology is really bringing, I would say, a huge amount of data and a really different way to consume. So you can see that, yes, in terms of 5G usage, as it has been said, it's the main growth is virtual reality, video, and gaming. So it seems that all operators report regular increase in wireless revenue for the time being. We not say that it's the holy grail right now, but yes, there are a way to monetize in a certain way this higher speed. So what do we have here? So that's from Nokia perspective or total network commercial 5G deal. And you can see that, and I really like this slide, not because this is our, I would say, commercial Nokia deals, but it's really depicting that it's not one region that is ahead or that it's a question of developed versus developing countries. It's when you see the markets and the take-up of our deals, it's everywhere. it could be in Europe, it's in Middle East and Africa, Latin America, and Asia and Oceania. So it's not like every time when we talked about 5G or new technology, say that, yes, it's something for the advanced country, we will just wait and see, and we will take the benefit afterwards in the second wagon. Honestly, on this one, and it was a little bit with already the case with 4G, here we see that we have the cases and the deployment everywhere. So this is very important to know that. And you've got, I would say, the notion of first and second wagon is more on spectrum allocation, on additional spectrum to move forward. But you can really see that, yes, that's a reality everywhere on every continent and at every stage of economic development right now. So, but now I would like to mention that, okay, we have seen, I would say, the mobile broadband aspect, and we need to see, okay, what would be the next, I would say, usage, or what are we looking for as well through 5G? So one of the key aspects that we have noticed is, despite the massive technology growth, the productivity growth is very different from the digital industries and the physical industries. So one is that the digital industry, which include technology, content, finance, insurance, professional and technical services, they have dominated the ICT spending for, despite the smaller share of the GDP. And their productivity has been growing at 2.7%. On the other side, however, is that of the physical industry, which despite the larger share of the GDP, has invested less in ICT, and the productivity growth has been roughly around 0.7%. So those industries include manufacturing, construction, mining, utilities, healthcare, hotels, foods, or transportation. So here is what we have to understand, and what we need to bridge is the bridging of the two industries needed to really unlock the tremendous potential of productivity growth. And everybody is estimating in like $1 trillion, but the thing is how we can modernize and increase the productivity growth of these physical industries. That is, I would say, the major share of GDP. And this is something that with 5G, with private network, that's something that we need to try to achieve. So this is what we're trying to do in a certain way inside Nokia, where we wanted to go beyond as well this consumer space and really try to see what would be the main impact of this new 5G, this new telecom mobile network generation and infrastructure. And we always said that it's not a new G, so it's not, one more speed. This is a total redefinition of the network and at different layers and in terms of virtualization. So what we're trying to do is, how can we work with certain partners? So with our main customer, which is our telecom operators like AT&T, StarHub, M1, or Optus in Australia, and see how can we use and work with them to modernize the different sectors like transportation, energy, the public sectors, the manufacturing, mining, and ports, because this is, I would say, the major point that needs to be modernized. So we are working with our partner, with certain partners, to reach out to new customers directly for us, and as well with our operators. So you can see that we are trying really to work with the Deutsche Bahn, with Lufthansa, with Toyota, for example, or so really to try in a way where the network can really change the processes and technique that are currently used, and really trying to see how we can optimize and maybe save time, saving lives, and as well maybe trying to reduce the energy consumption in a certain way. So we have, I would say, more than 400 private wireless network, which include 4 and 5G, and we've got roughly 80% of this progress of this project that is 5G. So there are a trend and there are needs for all these sectors, and even for operators to diversify and try to see what would be the next, I would not say killer application, which is not the case, but how they can really change their way and to address a market and to have new market as well. So here to give you an example, I mean, it's really what we have observed concerning the different sectors. So where in energy, it's really where it's like mainly on predictive maintenance, is how we can really increase the reliability of grid and really avoid the failing. So it's really failing and maintenance. Where I've got the mining, I think the key point here is really safety and for the workers, and really trying to get this autonomous aspect. And we have worked with a lot of mining companies already on you've got on plane, camera and analytics, so it's very important for the transport. Ports is something that we see as well getting a lot of traction, and Singapore and IMD has been, I would say, very supportive with a lot of test bed and trial, and one has been done by M1 that is, I think, very interesting to see. And you've got the manufacturing things, and I think that this is where everybody is looking at when they think about the Industry 4.0. It's what you can do to really take advantage of this low latency and security aspect of 5G. And then, of course, you get all the public safety part. I would like as well to mention one point, and I think that's one of the key aspects that I always tend to say, is that even if we're talking about 5G and connectivity is just really a small part. So the end-to-end connectivity is really, I would say, one small part, unfortunately for me, of the overall telecom value chain evolution. So this is where I would say, or the previous speakers have also mentioned the skilling, the need for really having trials and really trying to bridge the gap with the different sector, really to stimulate the ecosystem, really to have this collaboration. So to bring new application, to really have new professional services and even managed services. So the skilling, reskilling will be very important, because even if 5G will be the foundation, that we know that by experience, I will not tell you which sector will have a major boom, but just remember what the skeptical said about 4G. We said, yeah, nobody wants to use 4G, but nobody predict at that time how it would be used. But you see the major differences, and the creation of new startup or new company could only be happening with 4G. So with 5G and its possibility, new services will come, and states and policy should really try to facilitate and really embrace what can be done with that. And that's why when you see the application managed services, this is where I would say we need as well the stimulation and the creativity of the people. So this is, I would not say once more a call, but I think that, yeah, we have to think holistically about 5G and try to see how we can take the full benefit from that. And finally, as a slide, because I didn't want to present anything on 6G, but I say, okay, this slide may be very interesting for people. So I will not tell you in detail what is 6G, because it's still at the research phase. But I think one of the key aspects for 6G is, first, that will be important in terms of spectrum, where most of the band that 5G is currently using will be critical for 6G. And even if you see that there are lots of bands that has been highlighted by Amir, for example, in terms of refarming and so on, I think that it is very important already to anticipate. I think we have, let's say, most of the time, this is a 10 years sequence and transition, but you can see that the industry is already working on 6G, because we are starting to anticipate for 5G advanced and as well as 6G. So I would say one of the key parts, especially because we will add, I would say, some sensing and short range aspect. So it's really all these architectures, the chipset and software we work in all together. And the key things as well would be as well as the sustainability and energy efficiency. I think that will be a key point as well for 6G, where it has to be a sustainable technology. So on that note, yeah, I think maybe I overspend my time, but I think what I wanted to say is I really want to echo what my fellow speakers have mentioned. I think that we really need to have a 5G spectrum, a 5G digital plan in place. Spectrum is one part. Skilling and digital asset is very crucial. And we really need to do like what IMD has done with trials. And I think Australia has done an amazing job as well to really unleash the capacity and try to really supporting any trial and any test where this technology can be used. And I think that's very, very important. And Taiwan as well has done an amazing job. And we need to ensure that every new sectors can understand the full benefit of that and the security and the impact on their services. So there are a lot of education, a lot of stimulating, and a lot of training people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. So a lot of thoughts here. I'd love to first ask the panelists for brief reactions, if they have any, on what the others have said, just for a couple of minutes, if possible. And really on, I mean, because there's at least 2, if not 3 key areas, which are a bit chicken and egg, which is, well, we are seeing the potential for a digital revolution or industry 4.0 enabled by 5G, but we still have a fairly basic issues in a number of countries about the actual rollout and the business case for 5G. And so we can't really realize the full benefits because we don't have the networks, and yet we don't get the return on investment if we don't get Industry 4.0. So it's a tough situation. And then, of course, we can start thinking about the broader, longer terms, whether it's the actual technology evolution, already talks of 6G and what that might look like, but also what Industry 4.0 might look like, and what sort of emerging use cases there are, and what might be the role of policy and regulatory frameworks to enable them, and then perhaps to put the chicken in front of the egg, if that's the right image. With that, I'd love to open the panel to our panelists in the first place, and I would love to have also questions from the audience in the chat, so please go ahead. I know we've already got one, but please come in with other questions. So the floor is open to panelists for now, please. I don't know who would like to start to have some reflections on the overall panel.
So let me go first. 2-3 things that I noted. I think that what we have observed in the region as well. I agree with Guam in a sense that there is a need for further understanding. And in some of the cases, in many of the developing countries, what we thought that the operators, telcos, who should be on the edge of the curve, they must have good understanding of the ecosystem that they want to bring in. But unfortunately, in many of the cases, we see that they also don't have the clarity on why should they invest towards 5G. And this is one of the biggest concerns, because if the operator itself is not fully aware of the benefits that it can bring to their business, then the rollout would be very difficult. And one case that, for example, that was mentioned in one of the interventions is that we are trying to prioritize urban rather than rural. But we also have to see what the COVID has done. There has been a significant amount of population that has moved from urban to suburban. And there is a demand that is coming in the suburban regions. This is across many of the big cities. So in the planning as well, we have to make sure that this demands that is generated, we have to also see that it might not be the same pattern that we have been used to, the deploying in urban and then going towards the rural. Just a few points on that.
Gavrois, maybe we'll start taking questions from the audience, and what we'll do before we finish the session is I'd love a few sort of concluding thoughts from each of you panelists and recommendations to finish the scene. But let's go into questions. I was
I just have, I mean, yeah, I know it's just to open, I think Bharat opened a very interesting point where he said, yeah, even in terms of billing, I think it's that would be an interesting point, because you are moving, I mean, if you remember what happens with 4G, where most of the time at that point the operators were billing just voice, and they had to move to, I would say, almost data only billing. I think there are maybe some discussion or a debate on what would be the next billing approach as well from the operators, because I mean the way of, I mean, what they will sell will be maybe totally will be different to what they are selling right now. So it could be really like the QI, quality of services, a really different type of services, like the managed services aspect that can have some issue, for example, in Europe. But maybe, yes, the tariffication will be different.
No, I totally agree. And that was one of the questions in terms of, are the policymakers willing to look at alternatives? So the traditional kind of pricing model is not something that would really allow us to monetize the investment. And we've seen this in other countries where we've rolled out 5G, where if we go with a traditional data pricing model, it's very difficult to charge a premium for 5G to say, okay, it's a little bit faster. Customers don't really pay for a little bit faster. So how can you align the pricing model with the key kind of attributes you're delivering for 5G, which is, as you say, low latency, reliability, etc. So how do we potentially charge a different mechanism based on quality, for instance? Is that something that policymakers would be willing to allow? And the other question which I mentioned, which wasn't picked up, and be good to see what the reaction from policymakers is, which is the kind of USO regime. So as I said earlier, and you demonstrated this yourself from the Nokia study, which is a lot of the investment is going from the telcos, but the value captured by MNOs is a very small percentage of the value created. So I think it'd be useful to look at who are the contributors and the beneficiaries of investment in 5G, and should there be a question mark about who should contribute. So yes, the point from Amir, which is we need 5G in semi-rural areas, semi-urban areas, I agree, but who's going to pay for that? So a USO regime may be useful in that context, but then who should contribute to that? Who's actually generating the value from the investment in 5G infrastructure? And today, a lot of the value is generated by some of the other digital players, the video content providers, etc. Should they be contributing to a USO regime? I think that's an open question, and it'd be good to see if this is something that policymakers are thinking about.
Yes, I think that goes to the earlier question that was raised, I think, in a couple of slides about the demand side and how we motivate users to want to take up 5G, depending on what content and services they want to use, and what will attract them to 5G as opposed to the existing packages on 4G, and less that they might be able to attract. So how do we make sure we have a symbiotic ecosystem and a virtuous cycle? So I'd love to hear, actually, if they're happy to comment at this stage from our policymakers and regulators on the panel on these points, including the point about maybe novel approaches to regulation or to price regulation in this particular case. I don't know if Harin or Dr. Tang or Amir would like to react to those.
Thanks, Jean-Jacques. Let me go first. I'm not sure to what extent some of those questions apply to the Singapore scenario. For the mobile, I mean, we deem the markets as competitive, so there isn't price regulation in the manner that I think Bharat was referring to. So the operators are free to charge by data or by minutes or by quality or whatever they feel like. I mean, generally, they do shadow each other fairly closely in how they price their services. So at the moment, I think we're getting larger and larger data bundles, and consumers are generally, I think, happier. but it's chipping into the margins of the operators. There were other questions about the urban and the rural divide. As some of the speakers have noted, Singapore being a city-state, we don't have too much of a hinterland, so we don't face that particular issue. But relating to that, I think was the point of USO. So we also don't. I suppose the question was on the USF, I suppose, the Universal Service Fund. So we don't actually have Universal Service Fund either. Basically, I think they put the obligation on the mobile operators to cover nationwide, and our nation is not that big, so the obligation is really not that onerous. So the other one about pricing 5G differently, I think speakers also noted that in terms of straight throughput, it could be incremental over 4G. I mean, generally, most countries you see the 4G is quite good. So if we just go by EMBB, the differential is hard to justify. As to why consumers would subscribe to 5G, I really don't think it is because they saw that the 5G speeds are much better. I mean, if you just take experience from my own family and friends, it's because the 5G phone is a better phone. So they go for the newer phones out there in the market, and it happens that this is the latest phone and I want it, and it comes with a 5G plan. And that's what I'm seeing, and don't want to trivialize it, but just that's my experience at the moment. Thanks.
Hey, I think it should be my turn, and I would like to add some new information about what I described about the Taiwan's experience. So for the first, for the public service, Taiwan doesn't suffer too much on deploying 5G. The first thing is because there are 5 MNOs in Taiwan. So the market is approaching perfectly competition. So, and another thing is that Taiwan has maybe the very high population density. So we also have a very cheap price in subscribing the 4G or 5G service. So even in Taipei City, in the 4G era, consumer can benefit the download speed like 150 megabit per second. That's quite, for normal uses is more than enough. But however, we still, after 5G business starts, and for 18 months, the consumer that using 5G has already exceeded 2 million. That's the first fact. And I believe that it is because that the price itself is not that expensive in Taiwan. So, however, what really bothers NCC is that at first we realized that 5G is not like 4G or the previous generation. Is that the real benefit, the real power of 5G is it is an enabler to other industry sectors. So that's why I talk about 5G private network, is because that for the MNOs, they still want to compete with other companies by extending the market share. But we have to tell them that no, you have it now. It is a business, is an industry sector. You have to extend. You have to extend your B2B market, not the B2C again. And on the other hand, for the industry sector, they have very extremely few experience to dealing with regulator, so they don't trust the government. When we say, okay, you're welcome to apply the experimental private network, they worry, okay, but the license has only 6 months. How will I know you will not cancel, or you'll allow me to renew it? So ironically, in Taiwan's case, so this is the the most focus. We have to focus on this part instead of the deploying the public service.
Thank you. I think we're only just getting started. We could go on for a couple of hours, but I'm conscious of a couple of questions in the chat. It would be good to just add that. There was a really good question earlier. Hope it hasn't disappeared from my screen. It has disappeared from my screen, but I seem to recall it. Basically, I think the question was around how we might foster, encourage cooperation between various actors and stakeholders in the sector. For instance, in some of the difficult discussions around sharing of bands, you know, when we have to continue to share the 700 megahertz band, or also coexisting between 4G and 5G, and some of you will of course have read about the recent issues in the US with the aviation industry and their concerns about 5G interference. So it would be interesting to hear views on how we bring people together. We've heard a little bit about the Taiwanese and Singaporean experience of bringing in stakeholders, but it would be great to have a bit more about the good practices to encourage cooperation across sectors. Any comments on that from anyone?
To be honest, I think these people just need to collaborate more, right? So I think the policymakers need to bring in the different sectors. And typically that's the broadcast satellite operators. Sometimes it's the other government agencies, the security agencies who tend to sit on certainly the 700 band. And that tends to be the most difficult in terms of convincing existing government owners to try to vacate some of that spectrum. But I think on the 3500, I think there are cases where they are coexisting. So the 3500, some of it is used for satellite, some is used for mobile. So I think it just really is a case of people just need to talk more and collaborate, and just find out how we can work together, frankly. And sometimes people do vacate the spectrum. They realize that there's more value from use in another industry than themselves, or they can find some additional spectrum that they can use. So I think there's no real answer to that. I think we just need to talk it out, frankly.
Yeah, so using the convening power of policymakers and regulators to bring people to the table, I suppose. Thank you. Yeah. I'm just conscious of time, and sorry, did you want to go, Guillaume?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I tend to agree. I think that honestly, there are part of discussion that is very important, but then it's also based as well on the availability of the resources as well. I think the point with 700 megahertz is indeed in some countries it's a very complicated debate because it's owned by the broadcaster, but there are alternatives. There are new technology where broadcaster can really develop new services, and there are digital TV that is ongoing. We're not, I mean, for example, IMDA has done a wonderful work by having the digital transition. And I think it's also at a point where you have to take a decision, and you have to listen for every side. But I think this is also the economic reality where if at one point you consider that everybody is right, yeah, you cannot move. So there are some decisions that should be taken, and I think for 700, as it has been shown, this is one of the golden band for 5G. Same for 3.5. So if you decide not to allow 5G on 3.5, what's the alternative? So that's why, even if yes, there are discussion that is needed, and you mentioned even if it's not I think a problem in Asia, but the altimeter is potentially just a question where the altimeter were an old technology out of date, and maybe just a point where they are trying to find any way to get replaced by subsidies. So there are time of discussion, but I think that it's also based on the digital transformation of the country as well. So you have some time decision to take, I think.
Thank you, Guillaume, and I'm sorry because I've got many more questions I want to ask and listen to the panels, but we're getting to the end. So could I ask each panelist just to give us perhaps one or two key recommendations, either for unlocking the current issue of extending and making the networks actually a reality, but also, and importantly, I think, to unlock that potential of Industry 4.0, whether it's use cases or perhaps policy tools as well. I'd love to have one or two key thoughts to conclude the session from each of the panelists. And just to make it simple, I will go in the order that we did the introductory remarks. So if that's okay with you, Amir, I might start with you for one or two key recommendations.
Thanks. One would be that is related to what the broadcasting is. In most of the developing countries, one of the suggestions that I made even in the presentation is if there is a refarming fund that is established at a national level, that would help the countries because in most of the developing countries, the issue is of the funds to transfer from analog to digital TV. So if there is a refarming fund, that would be much easier. On the policy level, I think that the government should look into it, that how the new ways to give access to the spectrum would be, because the current methods, the current pricing and the reserve pricings, they might not work for the 5G, because the requirements of the spectrum are going to be very high. And maybe these are the two from my side.
Thank you. It's an interesting proposal. And I think next, Dr. Tang, please.
Yes, the government is listening here. Just a joke, sorry. Okay, so I think how to utilize the frequency band is a never-ending question, and we are always doing the survey. And just like I said before, that in 5G era, I believe that the application is totally different. Just like Guido's slide also showed up. So, but one thing is that I mentioned many times that there are 5 MMOs in Taiwan, but now 2 smaller ones started to consider withdrawing the market. So we do have many frequency band to consider, which we should ask them to reassign or exchange to each other. So there will be a very busy year today in this year for Taiwan. So, but yeah, I consider that multi-sector collaboration and communication is is everything we have to do for each month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tang. Mr. Greville.
All right, thanks, Jean-Jacques. I'll be brief. So on the earlier question of consumers and 5G appealing to that, I did mention that consumers basically go by what handset is available, but I just wanted to at the same time I think point out that the opportunity for the operators is really on the industry and the enterprise space, and which is why actually IMDA has put a lot of focus on the use cases and on innovation and on the platforms that we make available for our partners and industry players to try and see how they can actually make best use of 5G in this case. So I just briefly wanted to address that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd love to pick this up, actually, Harin, with you and others about really communicating more about those use cases, some of them that are already here and emerging, and share that and promote that a bit more actively, because I think people are not seeing them all. But Singapore's got some great examples indeed, as you mentioned, with the Maritime Authority, for instance, amongst others. Dr. Barad, please, for your concluding recommendations.
Thank you. So I think a couple of points. One is the operators need regulatory certainty. So the license term, the conditions in the license, being realistic or what can be achieved. So the coverage obligations of the license, I think we need to start off with what is realistic in terms of maybe urban areas and then slowly moving out to other areas. So that was the one side. And the other side is really, let's not forget that the pandemic, while it's been dreadful, it has accelerated adoption of some services. So let's see how policymakers continue offering services that customers would desire, e-health, e-education, etc. So those things will create the demand and pull in operators to invest because they can see people using some of these services. So I think that, again, back to my point, 2 sides of the coin when you look at both sides. Thank you.
Thank you. And Guillaume, please.
And yeah, I think I would repeat, like on Spectrum, about support of trials and use cases and skilling, as it has been mentioned by my respective speaker, by the respective speaker. I would say one last point that it was a bit covered. I think that what we need as well is a new set of, I would say, a regulatory approach, but not only from a in the telecom space, but I would say a sectoral approach. Try to see what could be the impact of this new technology and the digital part to, I would say, all the sectors, and what could be the disruption, and all the regulation, like in banking, healthcare, and so on, should potentially evolve as well.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you all the panelists. I think there's actually a lot that has been covered in this panel, but also a lot that's available publicly, perhaps that the wider international policy and regulatory community does not hear enough about. Great research by the likes of McKinsey and others about some of the use cases, just amongst many other things, and a lot of useful recommendations and emerging examples of good regulatory practice. And we've just heard from Taiwan and Singapore about some of the really forward-looking approaches that we could think about. And perhaps it's also a question of thinking about how best we can communicate that to the wider community. So might be something for the IIC to do more on. Maybe we can think also about using the journal of the IIC Intermedia for some of that, and think about other follow-up initiatives to make a difference in practice. And so again, many thanks to the panelists and to the audience for a great discussion. I look forward to the next one.